classes of 1930, 1931, and 1934, before he transferred to Central Collegiate. Note also a new teacher on staff, Mr. Herod, with a senior class from 1935. Beck's library, the present home ec room, had a humble beginning, but was always a place for industrious students to increase their learning to the point where some were rewarded for their efforts, such as these 1934 groups. And these individual 1933 winners, John Morrison, Fred Skelton, Edna Arska, and Maudie Taylor. No sooner had the students moved to the new school than they began the production of a school magazine named The Lantern after the lamp standards in front of the school. These early Lantern staffs, like the General Council, show the prominent role teachers played in the production of these magazines.
Other extracurricular activities of the time included the Literary Society with advisors Dr. Goldstick and Mr. Blake, speakers and debaters guided by Mr. Langford, whose training led to city and Wausau oratorical winners seen here with their trophies. Another big area of life at Beck could be found in the old gymnasium. Both girls and boys took part in gymnastics. Early phys ed dress for girls, bloomers and black lisle stockings, was a far cry from today's. Even the dumbbells they exercise with have disappeared, while the boys' dress and activities seem to have changed less. Team sports such as basketball, seen in these shots of Harv Stewart's teams of 1932 and 1934, and Bill Ryder coaching junior boys basketball in 1933, and even Pop Adamson coaching in the late 30s were very popular. The 1928 track team, coached by Mr. Hill, 1932 relay team with their trophy were other boys' activities. The girls, not to be outdone, had their basketball teams coached by such luminaries as Miss Ruman, Miss Blondie, Miss Lewis, and Miss Sexton. Girls' chorus lines were certainly more attractive than the boys, in spite of the modest leg coverings of the time. Boys played hockey in the old London Arena with Coach Weedmeyer Mark in the 20s, and Howard Stewart taking over in the 30s. Howard showed his versatility by also coaching the 1931 rugby, as it was then called, team, and again in 1932, and 1934. From the very beginning, another great part in Beck's life was played by music, as illustrated by this view of Beck's first orchestra under the direction of Miss Taylor. Carried on into the early 30s, with Mr. Shadow coming from outside the school to direct. Mr. Wheeler also came in from outside to direct an operetta in 1931. The orchestra continued in 1933, but grew much larger under the energetic direction of Don Wright, who joined the Beck staff in 1934-35. Meanwhile, the staff also managed to play at picnics, but the dress was still rather formal, with all except Mr. Bartley wearing ties, Mr. Blake a vest, and Mr. Johnson not even removing his suit coat. Howard also removed his tie while looking after this early version of a barbecue, while his Messrs. Grote and Adamson watched. As the 30s drew to a close, the murals in which Beck students for over 40 years have taken great pride began to appear on the previously blank walls of the auditorium, showing phases of life from youth to old age. These were created by art teacher Selwyn Dudney, who painted himself into a very small corner of the stairway leading to the old cafeteria beneath the stage.
Don Wright ushered the Glee Club into the 40s. But then left, and Max McGee took it over and used it as a focus for one of the many variety nights of the 1940s. By 1944, Carl Chapman had arrived and conducted the Glee Club. And the orchestras of the middle 40s. In 1947, the old Glee Club and orchestra uniforms were discarded and replaced by smart new jackets, skirts, and trousers for the boys. Through these years, Mr. Bartley provided a link by singing and sometimes playing in the orchestra. Started at Beck in the 40s became prominent and internationally famous as the Four Quarters. played their usual prominent part in Beck's life, as Harv Stewart was now finally reduced to a supporting role, and finally superseded by Dunk Hoople and then Terry Ferris, both of whom won championships in basketball and also in football. A landmark triumph was that of the 1946 football team, the first London team ever to win over Windsor in a WASA tournament. Their trophy joined 2 for track and 1 for music in the great 46-47 year. In 1948, Terry Ferris coached the Beck junior football team to yet another WASA championship. And the following year, after Dunk Hoople had gone to Medway, he and Marsh Morris won another city championship. Meanwhile, the girls were active in basketball, both in the gym and out on the back campus. You'll note the old Highbury Bridge overpass in the background. The Warriors brought the flag into gym exercises. You'll note that it was the Union Jack then. Many of Beck's students, particularly the boys, went off to war, and some were decorated for bravery. After the war, the Air Cadets continued for a couple of years as this parade, led by Dunk Hoople and Harv Stewart, shows. Also after the war, Mr. Johnson was presented with a ceremonial sword by Lieutenant Colonel Tom Lawson. It and a memorial plaque to Beck students who lost their lives in the war still hang in the front hall of the school. The years after the war saw a new group, the Key Club, sponsored by the Kiwanis Club of London, formed at Beck. Meanwhile, school went on. A grade 13 class working hard in the chemistry lab, run by Mr. Ramage, is seen here. And hard workers were still found in the expanded library. Teachers like Pop Adamson, shown here at his desk, encouraged students to become award winners like this group. The real end result of all this work can be seen in the graduating classes of 1943, seen here, the mid-40s, and the late 40s. Principal W.C. Johnson took Beck into the 50s, along with such teachers as Mr. Bartlett, Miss Cameron, a newcomer named Roger McCauley, and Cap Pritchard. As the 40s came to a close, the first thought of the new cafeteria was done by then board chairman Miss Evelyn Harrison as Principal Johnson. Other officials, staff, and students watched. The new cafeteria was quickly put to good use as for ordinary meals and also for special occasions such as this grand banquet.
Graduating classes still assembled for their photos as Beck moved into the 50s. These groups span the years from 1950 1958. Meantime, Carl Chapman continued to lead the Glee Club groups. Johnson's final year, he joined the 1951 quota along with Mr. Ramage. Groups from the early and mid-50s followed. Students will never forget this conference championship basketball team. When Doug Thompson won the game with a floor-length shot in the dying seconds. Roger McCauley took over from Terry Ferris and won another conference championship in 1952, and then capped his Beck career by coaching the great 1957 team, which won the only hockey championship ever won by a London team. Meantime, a Wassa football championship was won by Terry Ferris's junior team of 1952, and a conference championship by newcomer to Beck, Will Rice, in 1956. In other fields, the school Army cadets brought honor to the school by winning the Strathcona Shield in 1957. The Kiwanis Park Teen Town in 1954 presented a plate and lectern to the school. An oak planting celebrated the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. The girls provided their share of memorable moments with precision displays both outside and inside. Carl Chapman continued to lead the singing auditoriums, seen here in 1958, and also to direct such Gilbert and Sullivan operettas as HMS Pinafore in 1951, Pirates of Penzance in 1952, and the Mikado in 1955. Mr. Askew provided the dramatic leadership in all of these, and Mr. Lilly assisted Mr. Chapman in Herman. Will Rice joined Barb Knighton in a partial production of The Pirates at the end of the 50s. Throughout this period, Mr. Armstrong gave great leadership. But in 1957, Mr. Ramage, the only vice principal Beck had ever known, finally retired. saw 4 young Liverpudlians bring a new wave in music to the Western world called Beatlemania, while here in London, a new Beck took shape as the familiar lanterns gave way to the architect's new frontal design. The old was not entirely lost, as Mr. Armstrong saw in the new addition, but with a greatly increased staff. Some of the old familiar faces remained, such as Hard Stewart and Miss Dolan. Mr. Chapman became vice principal, and Miss Durant, Mrs. Graver and Bell, and Mr. Frank stayed on, as did Mr. Dunlop, Miss Beer, Mr. Simpson, and Mr. Milburn, seen here with Dog, and Mr. Pirac took up permanent residence in the new addition. Newcomers such as Miss Hutchison, later Mrs. Hutchinson, and Miss Edwards, Mr. Fitchett, Mr. Cox, Miss Baker, later Mrs. Graham, and Mrs. Wallace, formerly Bernice Bent, a student of the early 50s, and Mrs. Rittenberg joined the staff. A larger office staff, several pictured here, first came in to aid and finally, as she retired, to replace Mrs. Schaaf. Another Beck fixture to disappear from the scene in the 60s was Cap Rainsbury, at that time the only custodian Beck had ever known. Romance bloomed between Miss Waite and Mrs. Gladwell, Mr. Gladwell, another former Beck student. As the staff grew and changed, student councils, now much larger and more student-oriented than in the 30s, came and went. And Mr. Attridge made his first appearance as student treasurer. Mrs. Hutchinson's bevy of beauties ruled girls' athletics. Prefects made their first appearance in the Beck scene. Sport went on with more and more schools involved. Football games continued to be played for a while at the back park, and championships were won by Dunlop-directed teams in the mid-60s. And the soccer team finally won another championship under Mr. Hoffman. Benny Benbow's boys brought a WASA championship in volleyball to Beck. Hockey returned for a while to Beck with somewhat less success, despite the efforts of coaches Tuck and Dooley. But wrestling became popular, as this Fletcher coach team shows. Basketball, however, was still the favorite winter sport. Cheerleaders continued to support both inside and outside activities, and girls' sports took on new life under coaches such as Miss Dinich and Mrs. Hutchinson. Under the guiding hand of genial Jeff Milburn, current affairs gatherings brought in speakers from many countries. Mr. Stevenson kept a cadet presence going in the 60s. at the Queen of the Ball was a highlight of social activities, and the tradition of a special Christmas dinner continued. Carl Chapman took his glee club into the early 60s. But in the bigger school, the band was directed by such leaders as Mr. Skelton, the glee club was taken over by Mr. Fagan, another former Beck student. Later, Mr. Head took over the band. Mr. Fagan developed smaller singing groups to complement the larger glee club. Drama continued to be popular, directed by Mr. Reed and later Mr. Fowler. One of the most popular productions was The Tea House of the August Moon. Graduating classes grew ever larger, as these three shots from the 60s show. These three teachers held up their hands as if to be excused, and all, in fact, did leave the school. Mr. Grote retiring after 35 years at Beck, Mr. Hickman and Mr. Braun leaving after shorter periods. As Beck moved into the 70s, the athletic tradition continued strong, with both boys and girls teams winning WASA volleyball championships. In the 70s, Mr. Paris returned to Beck as principal, succeeding Mr. Chapman, and renewed his old interest in track and field. Cheerleaders added more paraphernalia, and Beck's spirit saw Super Spartan emerge to help him cheer on Andy Stockart's many football teams, which now played their games on school fields instead of at Labatt Park. Sometimes, as these lone faces will attest, his teams met defeat. More often, as this locker scene shows, they were victorious, followed by a trip to the Red Barn or elsewhere to celebrate. Basketball ended the 70s. Other sports had their devotees, such as curling and girls' basketball teams. Coached by Miss Ellis and Mrs. Weaver, had considerable success played with such determination as seen in this shot. Volleyball, coached by such non-athletes as Miss Hare and Mrs. Tuck, also was popular. One of the great moments in Beck's athletic history saw Haley Martineau win an OFSA championship in gymnastics. Less serious sport in the 70s, saw the formation of many class teams like Lewis's Lovelays compete in fun events on Beck's back campus. Even such oldies as Mr. Letts and Mr. James played their parts. A winning team celebrates in this shop. Outside the school, one of the great events of the 70s was always the grade 11 outdoor education trip to Collingwood organized by Mr. Stevenson. Beck's friendly spirit shows in these scenes outside and inside its walls. No, Dan Pasek isn't eating that microphone, he's talking into it. And Carol's friend is not really pregnant. I wonder if anyone recognizes this young dreamer associated with this classroom. Well, it was Albert Bartlett, shown here at his retirement after 38 glorious years of teaching at Beck. At his retirement reception, he needs must lead Alouette one last time. A familiar threatening pose for a former student, and then he and his wife Jean, watched over by associate Mr. Tuck, leave.
Later in the 70s, Beck celebrated its 50th anniversary by inviting Lieutenant Governor Pauline McGibbon to replay the role of the Lieutenant Governor in 1927. Then, in the spring of the year, the school welcomed back its 50 years of graduates with Mr. French's choir. The registration desks saw new and old together. In the halls, Mr. Shales, at 90, was the oldest former teacher to return. But many students from the 30s and 40s came back to see teachers like Don Wright. Former Glee Club members, even pregnant ones as shown here, joined to sing together under Carl Chapman. And the popular auditorium singing was restaged with somewhat older faces and voices. As Donna Hutchison, formerly Donna Steinbeck, again played the organ as of old. And a quartet of teachers sang as three of the four quarters and other former Beckites watched, and Mr. and Mrs. Grote enjoyed the evening. Old acquaintances were renewed. Doug Cooper and Doug Thompson, Marsh and Pam Morris and John Cook and his wife, Ted Collins and Mr. Bartlett, Bill Tucker with Stan and Shirley Strickland, the former Ray Barrett and Howard Papp, Jerry Witherden and friends. Among returning teachers were the Langfords and Mr. Ramage, seen here with former students. The reunion closed with a church service bringing back several former Beck students who are now ministers in various churches inside and outside London. Just as the 77 reunion closed, came Terry Ferris's retirement. The girls' home ec class of that year presented Terry with a 50th anniversary quilt they had done as a class project. Then an outstanding group of past and present teachers and students roasted Terry in a final auditorium, and he was presented with this wine cooler. And later, a group of his former star athletes gathered at Terry's Farms for an afternoon of fun and games. Despite Terry's retirement, Beck continued to enjoy life, as these happy faces will prove. We're told Miss Lewis is not really running to the little girl's room. And this patriotic soul is really a transplanted American exchange teacher, Mr. Buckingham. And even principals got involved in the dress-up game to tightly illustrate. But next he is seen in a more normal environment with Dr. Harrington. Christmas carol singing and collecting the Christmas food stuff were a more serious side to the fun and games, such as The Night Before Christmas with Santa and his staff of reindeer. On the serious stage, Mr. Tucker's senior English classes presented the Doodle Thief from Hamlet. And figurative productions directed by Mr. Beer included Little Abner and The Boyfriend.
Into such happy scenes came the knell of doom represented by this headline. Despite gallant protests outside the Ed Center and inside it, the end is near. Even as Beck reaches its last months, the school maintains its proud athletic image with 2 championship girls volleyball teams. Here pictured is the final grade 13 graduating class. In this shot, the 1981-82 student body and staff is in front of the school and calling our shot from the 20s. Finally, as we see the last vice principal, the last principal, Mr. Cummings, Beck reaches the autumn of its life.
Drop him off and get him there get him to the church on time. Well, you got pretty good safety.
Folks, we'll be starting the singing auditorium in about 15 minutes. So if you have to leave yourself, be prepared. There's going to be a crowd coming in, and it's going to be very crowded very shortly. So what we need you to do is help us get everybody in position by 2 o'clock.
I don't know if they were trying to do something. I don't know. Forget you. I don't know.
Well, I try to stay, I try to keep a low profile, you know.
Yeah, right. Oh, she put the kids. They got back from the yeah. So she helped them move some of their stuff back. I picked them up at the airport. Well, it should be there for the Well, I didn't even suggest that she come to this. Because I've been to a couple of hers and I know how boring it is for somebody not being part of the school.
Well, I wasn't probably in a...
It's hard to say. Oh, yeah. Like Brian said, it's really good to see it all. Yeah, I think so. I know. It's hardly come out. It's something new. Oh, okay. Now I can see the one on the stage. Not on your large. Hey, House, how you doing? Oh, it's been a day or two, hasn't it? What's new and exciting with you?
Oh, not much.
Not much. Same old, same old.
No, play tennis.
Good.
Try and keep going.
So you're still playing tennis?
Yeah.
I quit after you wrecked me so many times over at the park there.
I don't play anymore.
Oh.
That's lots of fun. So where are you living now?
Cambridge. What about you?
A lot more. Our posse. How big he is.
Good, anyhow.
And Cherry Allen,
Yes,
I went to
Mom.
public school with.
Yeah.
Did you see Bruce Lewis?
Nope.
See you really well.
Is he?
It's good to see you.
Well, hey, at our age, it's good to be seen.
Well, my mission was to find you, and I talked to your son in Stratford,
Oh, yeah.
and then he was to give you the message.
Yes.
And then we finally found you. Cherry,
I'm staying up in the colony and some of the cheerleaders that are
Oh, yeah.
no, in London.
Fan interest.
I stayed here at this school for basketball.
And just as much getting accomplished.